It's time to get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce Inman Harvey, who is going to be giving this month's ENSO seminar. I met Inman at the University of Sussex, where he was running the Evolutionary and Adaptive Systems master's program there, which really kickstarted my interest in areas that we're talking about in this seminar series. And I'm really pleased that Inman can be here to tell us where we're going wrong in our ways of thinking, which is something he's quite good at doing, I reckon. So it's without any further ado, I'm going to select Inman's screen. Inman's doing something new with his talk today, where he's going to be showing a little video of himself in the upper right-hand corner during the slides, and we're hoping that that works well. And I'll just ask you to take it away if you could, Inman. I'm going to mute everybody else, so it might sound a little bit strange for you, but we're all still here and we're all still watching. So thanks very much.
Don't mute yourself yet, because I want to see whether my screen's... Can you see my screen?
Yes, your screen looks good. We got both your video in the upper right-hand corner and the slide.
Okay. Okay, in that case, let's take it away.
Great.
So, going around in circles, cognition, learning, got to complete the loop from action to perception, and perceptual control theory back in the 1960s, early movements to say, let's see behavior as control of perception. Predictive processing, Friston in the more recent decades seems to be reinventing some of perceptual control theory. Now, both the GoFi, how perceptions enter the person, whatever, and get translated to action, are half right. Perception people are half right, but clearly, to be fully right, you've got to have the full circle. And of people such as W. Ross Ashby, and they're from cybernetics, autopoiesis, and my background's evolutionary robotics, emphasize the complete cycle of interactions between organism and environment, and the notion that if you're trying to understand it, you've got to get the dynamics right of this circular interaction. Concepts that Ross Ashby produced, such as essential variables and viability and related notion of fitness, are all part of understanding the circular process of cognition and life. So, if my next screen, which inevitably discussing circular causation. This talk is the confusion that arises from processes, causation, of which cognitive processes are the ultimate example. Causation, straightforward. Some agreed firm foundation, axioms we're not going to question. Fundamentally, every time you add on a little bit, it's onto a firm foundation that doesn't change. And that's the kind of linear explanation of linear that we're familiar with and we can generally handle. Problem with circular causation is there's no obvious starting place, there's no firm foundation. First the chicken or the egg. And basically you've got to have lots of different component parts, how they all fit together without any firm, definite starting place. So the point of this talk is to stress that circular processes, simple as you might think, and I'm going to demonstrate this with trivial, minimal, hardly even organisms, about as simple as you can get, and show that even in these simple examples you get misunderstandings and confusions. There's some technical details following. ultimately, this is, I think, a philosophical talk, and I'm a sort of Wittgensteinian who sees philosophy as linguistic hygiene, basically. So here I'm trying to get rid of the particular understandings, understanding how circular causation works. So a first pet rock, no behavior, no moving parts. I think we can handle that okay. What's the next most, you don't really want to call it an organism, but here's something that moves under an external force. The wind will blow a log of wood across the water. Yeah, no moving parts. Step up from that. And here's where, one step up from that, I hope will confuse you, unless you've seen this before. And I know Matthew's seen this example before, and Ethan has seen this before, so keep your voices down. Anybody else who hasn't seen it before, I hope this puzzles you. Imagine a piece of wood, like the previous example, floating on the water with a single moving part. A single shaft, the propeller, at great expense, I've equivalent. So you've got one propeller in the air, driven by the wind, and one propeller in the water. Clearly, the previous example of a log under a 10 kph wind accelerate up to something less than 10 kph of the water resistance. Set up, there's only one component part here, but there's things like the blade and whether they're both right-handed or left-handed blades. Can you set up the parameters of the blades so that the boat goes faster than the wind downwind? The acronym for this is DDWF. Can it move directly downwind faster than the wind? So if you do a search for that acronym, you'll find various YouTube videos and so on, one of which I'll show you in a moment. Surely not. Surely it can't go faster than the wind. People have. By the fan is between the boat velocity and the wind velocity. And if the boat accelerated up to the wind speed, there'd be no energy, there'd be no relative velocity, nothing, no drive from the wind to accelerate it even further. Cannot possibly work. Well, I like the boat example because it's got a single moving part, but in practice, it's easier to make it the equivalent, mathematically, physically equivalent system of you got the wind, the wind fan, wind propeller. You've got a gearbox and drive shaft. You've got more component parts, but in principle, this is the same as the boat example. And on my next screen, if I get there, is made one of these, and it's a rather small video because of the bandwidth limitations of Hangouts.
13, wind light and variable, about 5-6 knots.
Propeller geared through to the wheels on the road, and you may see to the left of the wind propeller a sort of white ribbon streamer on a thing. What the video showed, this white streamer, if you can see it, up. It was, in fact, the craft, the road craft in this case, was travelling faster than the wind. The stream was streaming off to the left, even though the wind was coming from the left also. This is, unless if you look on YouTube, lots of people think this is a hoax. This is actually travelling faster than the wind. Okay, so if you want to do the maths, which I'm not going to do, this is on the propellers. You've got a F1 on the top propeller, F2 on the bottom propeller, and F1 plus F2 add up to the drag at steady state. You've got torques on the propellers, T1 plus T2 cancel out. And let me assure you, if you do the maths, there are solutions do correspond to what you actually see if you set it up with the right parameters. This is impossible. Their misunderstanding, I think, comes from thinking, well, the wind must be driving the propeller, the wind propeller, and that is driving the boat propeller or the road wheels, which is driving the boat or the roadcraft. Actually wrong. The propeller I've shown on the bottom of the screen there, a slightly different propeller with the wind blowing. If you look at the angle of the blade, you'd expect that to be going clockwise. In fact, if you look at the video, the anti-clockwise. And I've got a couple of screenshots, if it comes up there. Hopefully, I'm not going to risk running this video. Things crashing. But let me assure you, propeller is running the wrong way to what you'd expect if you thought the wind was driving the propeller. Driving the propeller around, rather the propeller is being, the wind is pushing to the craft. The wheels on the road are forcing the propeller to turn around the other way to what you'd expect, and it's blowing the wind backwards. Stop this video and get onto the next screen to try and avoid the dreaded spinning wheel of death, which I can see at the moment. Can I just check you can hear me? You're still with me?
Yes, we're still here. Yeah, all is good.
Okay, fine. So I'm not going to go through the maths. I assure you that there is a logical physical solution, yet it's one which defies most people's physical understanding of what's going on, even though it's such a simple system with, in the boat example, yet a single moving part. Linear reason just falls down, and I'm interested in trying to work out why. And I think it's to do with frames of reference to use as the boat, the water, the fan, or with the wind, and where there's one basic fundamental framework, and yet we're in this nebulous situation where there are all these interacting frameworks, we don't know which one to go for. The pre-Copernicus and Copernicus, to use the shorthand for Earth as a fixed foundation and linear causation framework of the universe centered on the Earth. Can move is to say, hang on, different frameworks of frames of reference between them. Difficult. That I've called a proto-agent because it's got no notion of viability. So my second example is Daisy World. It's in viability, and I just set up the Daisy World briefly, if I can get my next screen working. So the faint early sun, particularly over the last few billion years, the sun's gone from very faint to relatively strong, yet the temperature graph of the Earth has wobbled around rather little, intervening 3 or 4 billion years. So there's been, in effect, planetary level, planetary homeostasis happened. And again, I'm waiting for my next basis. Something's happened. Locke in the 1970s suggested that somehow the planet is regulating itself to the temperature at which life can survive. It comes in, and So the simplified, most simple version of the model is Daisy World with just 3 variables, or 2 variables and a parameter. On the left is the number of daisies, which can be white daisies or black daisies, as an example. In the center is the local temperature of the daisies on the planet Earth. Right is the sun, which can be weak, as it was 4 billion years ago, or strong as it is nowadays. A parameter that may vary slowly. And you've got this circular causation loop between temperature and the temperature of the daisies. Light perception action. Look at the bottom of the circle. These are only viable at some intermediate range of temperatures. The part of the loop, the daisies influence the local temperature either positively, because black absorbs the sun and heats up, or negatively if they're a white daisy, loop with these function at the bottom and either a positive slope or a negative slope at the top. The steady states of that system are regulated by the S parameter. And if we look at the viability, I'm calling it viability here, the daisies have a viability range but of limit temperatures. In fact, be different shapes. This uses the inverted parabola function. Also use the more top hat shape. All shapes work. And what you're interested in, how as the sun changes on the left to large output of solar output on the right, to the feasibility range of S's, of the viability range of T's, which the daisies are viable. 2 different T depends on T, and feasibility depends on S, and this subtle distinction is rather important. Do the maths, you find that the black daisy extends the feasibility range to the left. Con effect of black daisies on their own local temperature is ability range. White daisies, screen comes up, increases the viability range to the right. So this is a form of homeostasis, the feedback effect of either of them, the range of the external forcing parameter, the sun. And just as the previous example, any number of people refuse to believe this can be true. Their reasoning appears to be something like, if a black daisies was in some sense good for homeostasis, increase the range of feasibility, then necessarily white with a negative effect must be bad. You can't have both plus and minus being both good. For linear causation, that argument sounds reasonable. Because it's linear causation assumes that single part of your system, daisies from black to white, for instance. With circular causation, everything stays the same. The left of these pictures is the black daisies, and the stable equilibrium is on the left-hand slope shown there, and on the right-hand pictures, the white daisies, and the equilibrium of the different slope is there. So I'm just gesturing at the mathematical reasons. The mathematics shows that it works, but nevertheless, any number of people simply do not believe it. I find this implausible, because people are used to a single basic frame of reference, causation, where there's no privileged frame of reference. Copernicus and indeed relativity, special relativity at any rate. examples of this. So my first are really simple. People find it difficult to understand. How much more confusing when we move to something more complicated. So let's look at and Ross Ashby based his homeostat motivation came from looking at a kitten and whether a fire was worth investigating or not, sticking its paw on the fire and finding it not a good idea. Variables. Typically, you've got the graph might show two of the essential variables, and within some limited region, inside that you're alive, outside it you're dead, typically with a hard boundary between the two. No distinction, live or dead, which has raised the homeostat is a crucial component. What's shown as the arrows, the meter that measures these essential variables. An essential variable goes above or below the limited viability range, some step change mechanism is triggered. But if you take the notion of essential variable literally, that's too late, you're dead then. Any changes are too late. And Ross Ashby kind of slightly glosses over that. I think actually he made a tactical error in using a distinction between viability in one sense, the property of a homeostat as a whole, which is the alive-dead, and viability in a related but different sense, which comes up as V2, which refers to a trigger signal within the system, within the mechanism of the system. Are related, but it's a category area to confuse them, and I think he spells it out, and the way people interpret it, it quite often is confused. One reason people confuse this is the kitten getting close to fire frame of reference. If you're trying to find how kittens can learn to stay away from fire, they need some kind of gradient to learn which way to move. But the formal essential variables frame of reference is a binary dead or alive without any gradient. And these two frames of reference to get from one to the other. They're different. For instance, Ezequiel de Paulo has long had a concern about this issue, which stress of the notion of adaptivity to autopoiesis in order to naturalize sense making. I'm just going to mention this in passing here. I don't understand what's going on there. But I could be corrected. This is another confusion between different frames of references in the context of circular causation. Asides here. The first is context. A binary dead or alive viability criterion, Kate, a shades of grey gradient based measure. So if you're driving a car home after 1 pint, 3 pints of beer, chance of dying's gone up higher. 10 pints of beer, then you're probably get home. There are ways of getting from binary viability to shades of grey, but this is yet another different frame of reference, not to be confused with the derived from. Second aside, the daisy word example, I happen to use a hat function hat with gradients either side, but actually that works with this strict binary feasibility range. To piece this in with the homeostat, for example, 3, because they both have the same viability boundary, but I'll gloss over that. These 3 examples I suggest is similar-ish terms that belong in different frames of reference that are difference Okay, in the first example, the boat example, and the wind drives the boat, but there's different things going on there. There's viability with respect to temperature, with respect to solar output. These are easily confused. Viability with respect to system as a whole versus viability with respect to trigger signal. Subtly different concepts, not to be confused. And these category errors are easily made just because circular causation has no privileged, blindingly obvious frame of reference. Circular causality is you should instead seek compatibility between multiple interconnected local frames of references. Look for stable and metastable states as a classic example. So, just in passing, the extended mind. You know, quite a few people in the inactive, autopoietic talk about the 4 E's, one of which is the extended mind. To my mind, that's just a basic confusion between the 3D physical space of brains and bodies and environment and the very different states of mental concepts. I think the extended mind is a classic confusion. Internal representations, which is something I've strong feelings about for decades now, between 2 frames of reference, things whole humans do, representations, of course, use of these by metaphorical homunculi in our common explanatory tactic, which I think is a good tactic, but by little homunculi inside, which I think is fair enough, provided you what you're doing representations for a homunculus with representations for the human being. So I've battled against representation of the brain, but representationalist, I'm in fact for the responsible use of representations located within their proper frames of reference, which may well include metaphorical homunculi, which are good explanatory tactic, except one particular scenario. If you're trying to explain cognition in representations, then clearly you can't use metaphorical homunculi as part of your explanation. That's explanans and explananda. Even simpler examples of circular causation can confuse, in that more complex examples, more confusions arise from lack of linguistic hygiene, keep track of multiple different frames of references, beware category areas. The really biggest circularity, which to my mind discussed or acknowledged sufficiently, is that when we build models of cognition, as in A and B in my top left diagram, these are representations for me and for you that we try to understand how a model organism relates to its world, to things in their world, and try and work out what are things that matter to those organisms. But models of cognition, the models A and B, are things in my world. Further, outer layer of circularity, things in their world, cognitive models, with things in my world, type of category area that I've been trying to highlight throughout. And so let's see if we lost you in some of the technology there.
No, we're all still here. Thanks for that, Inman. And I'll just, yeah, I see other people are applauding, but their microphones are all turned off, so you can't hear any of the applause. So, if you guys could go ahead. There we go. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Inman. I'll just remind, we've got a few people that are watching that are not here in the live session, so they can't speak, but they can ask questions just by going to the ENSO Seminars website. Inman told me before the session started that he has that website up on a different computer, so if you ask a question there, he will be able to read it himself, and I'll keep an eye out to see if any questions come up there. If I can, I'd love to kick off the discussion by talking just for a moment about the viability example that you gave, Inman. So there are these, especially with regards to the homeostat, and I guess to autopoiesis as well, because they're really related concepts. You mentioned a first concept of viability as the sort of the survival of the system as a whole, right? How viable is the system as a whole? Is it going to live or is it going to die?
Yes.
Is the cat going to live or die? And then the second is being a bit of a trigger, something to respond to so that you know you need to adapt, you need to change your strategy or something like that. And I do think that people absolutely can confuse those and make the category error that you're talking about there. But I also think there's quite a deliberate effort to try to figure out what the triggers would be, what the type 2 viability triggers would be that would be.
Type 2, was that what I call the trigger mechanism?
That's right. What are the triggers that are the best for for maintaining the system as a whole? So what are the best triggers so that you survive? And is there some way that you can look at the, like in the case of autopoiesis, is there some way that you can look at the self-maintenance of the system and keep track of it? I mean, that's what a lot of my work has been about, right? It's like you have a self-maintaining system and you can build a model of that, like the original 1973 model of autopoiesis, and you can look at the dynamics in that model and try to say, what are the variables in this model, or whether they're statistical variables or deterministic variables, and you say, what are the variables that best predict whether or not I'm going to survive or not? And wouldn't those make great triggers? And when you're doing that, I don't think you're necessarily making a category error, as long as you're careful, I guess. And yeah, it's just maybe a bit more of a comment than a question. But I guess I'm curious if you see that perspective, if you see what people are trying to do there.
Yes. Of course, if one brings evolution into the framework and you have reproduction, systems sharing a world, and hence, in some sense, selection between them for limited resources, dangers that select things that promote long life or life long enough to produce offspring comes sort of for free.
Yes.
The ethic people tend to focus on, if you like, they sort of say, well, okay, you can't have evolution until you've got a living organism. Let's focus on what's needed for a living organism. And then, for instance, Ross Ashby's motivation was, in a sense, a pre-evolutionary motivation. How could what kind of system could conceivably, to, if you're a kitten, avoid putting your paw in the fire? And the changes, the step mechanism changes within the homeostat. It's a version of internal evolution within the homeostat, shifting through step changes until one reached a stable equilibrium state. So there's all sorts of subtleties going on when you bring evolution to the frame. The how a system select, whatever term one uses, appropriate mechanisms for doing so.
I mean, I think,
or whether that covers your question, or whether your question was directed differently.
Well, no, I think it does address the question to a certain extent, but I guess what I didn't mention or didn't emphasize is that with a lot of the autopoiesis-based approaches to understanding adaptive behavior, often a motivation is to get away from using evolution to explain why we do things. The idea is saying, yes, evolution explains a lot, certainly, but there's also a lot that takes place over the timescale of the individual, and trying to understand how systems can act on their own behalf and explain what they're doing, not in terms of their evolutionary history, but in terms of their current organization. And that's what the effort is there. Whether it's misguided or not, who knows? Nobody knows that. But
yes, sure, yes. No, I accept that. And incidentally, I should stress here that I'm fascinated by Daisy World, and it's very little known. And one of the interesting things about Daisy World is that this form of homeostasis free in a non-evolutionary scenario. There's no evolution involved in typically you explain Daisy World in terms of things like daisies, some notional artificial organism, but it works just as well for liquid water, for instance. Liquid water is only viable between 0 degrees Celsius and 100 degrees Celsius. And liquid water, if it's in a system where it affects something like cloud cover or whatever, it's doing similar things to white daisies. Any effect it has in the environmental temperature, it is producing a form of homeostasis for free in the complete absence of evolution. And I think this is a striking thing that people should take note of, particularly if you're trying to see how and homeostasis can arise pre-evolution or in the absence of evolution. Daisy World is that.
Can I ask you, Inman, to turn off your camera sharing thing and turn off your screen share, and hope that it increases the quality of the audio coming in. You're understandable, but it does clip a little bit, and we should do everything we can.
So turn off my screen sharing. Stop sharing, yeah?
Yes, please. Yes. Then you should be able to see its chat as well.
Yes, is that better?
Great. Yes. Yeah, I think that will be better. And I'd like to open up the floor to other questions. Do any of you guys have any questions you'd like to ask? Or go for it, Christian.
Well, 3 remarks actually. I have to go in a minute, but first of all, the shameless plug, because you were just mentioning the notion of a trigger for survival or trigger for viability. I will give a talk in the beginning of August, this seminar, where we'll present a formalism to derive such a trigger from ancient sensory motor dynamics. That was just a short shameless plug. Second, thank you very much for this talk, very interesting. I was wondering, does it exist in written form somewhere? And did you consider Varela's 84 article on the creative circle? Because I think he works on the, like, he treats the confusion that circular causation can cause in his article from various perspectives.
1984, I'm certainly not familiar with that, and that sounds, what was the title? It had circle in the title.
It's called The Creative Circle, Sketches on the Natural History of Circularity by Francisco Varela.
If I'd known of that, I would certainly have read it before giving this talk.
I mean, I guess in a related question, I'm wondering, a big theme in circular causality is feedback, right? And we have at least 2 principles of circular causality, I would say. Right? We've got negative feedback and we've got positive feedback. And then after that, we kind of get confused. I mean, confused beyond the point of being able to describe things. One
get confused just by the term negative feedback and positive feedback. Without screen share, I'll just have to draw circles in the air, right? Supposing you've got A affects B and B affects A, okay? That's about as simple a circle as you can get. it's very tempting to start somewhere saying, okay, A affects B and B affecting A is, and this is already, you've made a mistake there. Feedback is really a property of the whole circle. One part, B to A of the circle. And I've seen the confusion arising by people using feedback to refer to an individual and confusing that with the circle as a whole. And that is where the daisy world confusion comes from, typically. If a single part of the circle is negative feedback and I switch its sign, it must thereby become positive feedback. Sensible? False. You've got to look at the circle as a whole. And so even at this really trivial level, the common language can belong to the wrong intuitions.
I agree, for sure. I also don't know of any other language we can use, right? Do you, I mean, you don't have any other alternatives by any chance, do you?
Well, okay. Going back to Christian, actually, he asked, is there any way with this written up? And there is a reference to a 2-page extended abstract that's on the ENSO page, you can click through. But a previous paper I wrote did go into this positive feedback as a property of the feedback loop, or as a property of the loop as a whole. And I'm afraid it's a previous talk I gave and paper I gave at an eCal. Well, I gave them 2 or 3 or 4. So if you look at my previous eCal talks, at least one of those all relevant to what I'm saying today. But on that feedback issue, to suggest a form of wording to distinguish without hauling it up in front of me. I can't recall what I said at the time.
Thank you.
So if I'm understanding, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, if I'm understanding correctly, then yes, in essence, Inman is part of what you're suggesting in terms of the practicalities, that we make explicit the research question of what is the relationship between, as you termed it, V1 and V2. That there is a research agenda, and I think Matthew made the point that a large part of what people do when researching this area is precisely, what are the good triggers if your viability is V1, what makes good V2s such that the relationship between, that V2 properly ghosts or shadows V1 or supports it. So I guess what are the best practical methods of avoiding the kinds of confusion that we're worried about here? And is it just to make explicit a set of research questions about the relationship between V1 and V2, or are there other practices that we as a community might adapt?
Well, I'll tell you a bias that I have, which may be clearly, I'm going to argue for it, that what I'm saying is, I forget which way around it had it, but V1 is, let's say, is the viability of the organism, the homeostat as a whole. And V2 is the particular signal meter in the homeostat diagram measures. Like, to many people, hey, we're interested in V1, the viability of the organism as a whole. So if we had a specific little mechanism that reliably predicted or something like this, then this would be the ideal way in which, if we're building cognitive agents, building robots to do it, or if we're trying to understand how to do it, we should look for that in the biological organism. I think that's a mistake, the internal representation mistake. the same mistake as saying that if I see a tree out of the window, there's some little tree neuron. Or if I see a grandmother, there's got to be a grandmother neuron in my brain. There's got to be some relationship, focused node in the mechanism, and the mental conceptual level of description saying, I see and relate to a grandmother or a tree. I think that motivation by and representation nonsense, and even many neural networks are still trying to focus into having nodes or whatever that are doing that job, and that's simply the wrong intuition to go. I think you should that V1 organism is clearly of something of interest, in quotation marks, to the organism as a whole. Expect this to be mirrored in some unique part of the mechanism, as the homeostat specifically does. This is done in the 1950s and 60s and so on. You know, the first pass, you say, let's play around with supposing there is such a mechanism. I think this has misled people for so long. One should basically accept that V1 and V2 are conceptually different as a category error to, and not to then deduce that, say, well, okay, it'd be nice if V2 do that accurately mirrored, as accurately as possible, V1, but rather to throw away of V2. Say V1's what important is what important. V2, a bit of a confusion.
I mean, it's essential. It's essentially the not the reappearance, but the lack of you know, we have consistently failed to overcome Williams or James's psychologist's fallacy. It's that notion of, well, if this is how I understand it.
Uh-oh. Merrick is frozen.
We had a screen freeze there.
Yeah, I think it only affected Merrick, as far as I can tell.
I think it's Marek, yes.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's the fallacy that he was describing, is that we freeze or something.
Yes, exactly. I think Marek is unviable, basically.
Peter, I see you raising your hand there. Do you want to jump in with a question?
I was just thinking. I've been last few years I've been teaching a course in consciousness studies, and I bring up the metaphor of the ship of Theseus, which raises, you know, if you have a ship and the parts turn over, is the ship different, or is it the same ship if the organization of the thing is maintained? So a lot of these confusions are part-whole confusions about the properties of the parts and the component processes versus the properties of the whole organization.
Exactly. And autopoiesis is clearly a ship of Theseus.
Yes, it's the organization and not, well, it's both, but I mean, the nice thing about the autopoiesis metaphors and models is that it illustrates the relationships between the parts and the wholes in a pretty direct way. I had a question about your critique of the extended mind. I haven't been tracking those debates very closely, but you know, I've always thought of prostheses as extending a realm of control out into the environment. You know, if you have a pencil and a paper and you write down symbols on it, that's like externalizing a memory. And therefore, if you think about a realm of circular causation, you've extended the structural and functional parts of that realm out to include the operations of writing the symbols on the paper and reading them. I don't see anything problematic about that. I do have a strong critique of notions of an activist consciousness and extended consciousness. But again, the consciousness is in the environment, not in a realm of circular causation, extended or not. So can you just clarify a little bit your critique of the extended mind?
Okay. Well, clearly, if you're a blind man with a stick, feel the wall or the pavement.
Yeah.
My hand.
Yeah, and the stick becomes part of your body. In essence, the stick is a part of your body because you control it.
Exactly. Yes. So that goes without saying. The very language of extension of the mind seems to be used in practice, where I see it, in terms of locating the space, where to draw the boundaries between the mind and things outside between the internal and the external.
Mm-hmm.
Some people want to draw it around the skull, around the body.
Yeah, the parts. Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Versus the organization, which is what you have
draw
a realm of
boundary
control.
Boundary with structures and so on, but the mind, which is a circular reference.
Well, the mind is an organization.
It's wrong to locate it in all. I mean, what is one doing trying to draw a boundary? It's just
well, you
ludicrous.
can have a functional boundary of those processes that are part of the circular causal control realm, and those processes that are contingent relative to it. So with the blind man and the stick, the stick becomes part of the blind man's body, yes. So there's a structural, a shift in the structural boundary, but there's also a shift in the realm of the world that's under control of that nervous system that's wielding the stick. So you can make a functional boundary out of, and the boundary of the mind is really a functional boundary, not a physical boundary.
Well, if people talked about an extended functionality or extended structure or something, doing so, I might be less critical.
Yeah, okay.
Talking about an extended mind, and that's what I'm critical about.
Okay. I mean, maybe it's the use of the word mind in this sense, and a debate about different meanings of the word or different senses.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Great.
One thing that this conversation has gotten me thinking about is science is biased towards things that are measurable, and there's certain things that are measurable, and there's other things that are really quite different to measure. Like it's quite difficult to measure organization, right? Even if you're in your minimal example of A, and A influences B and B influences A, and you're saying it's not about the relationship, the feedback isn't in that, it's in the system as a whole, and that's really true. But man, is that a hard thing to pin down? You can talk about it in words, and you can get some distance with that. But I wonder if that's also part of the reason. I mean, as you said, some of these ideas, like Ashby's been around 70 years, and it's really hard to push them farther. I mean, I'd love to. I love these ideas. I love everything about circular causality. It really motivates me. But it really is, they're difficult concepts to attack scientifically, I feel.
Talking about Ashby, I'm an enormous fan of Ashby. He's the most influential person, but I think he made some mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
A related mistake is Conan Ashby paper. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. Conan Ashby is there's a really, I've heard people quote it. It's entitled something. Okay, the author is Conant, C-O-N-A-N-T, and Ashby, and the title is something like every good regulator of a system is a model of that system. I may not have that exactly right, but it's something like that. And if you read through, I personally completely endorse, says in the title, go through the sort of formalism, it seems to make largely sense throughout. And then he himself derives the false conclusion that every should have an internal model of what it is modeling. It should contain a model. This is just another classic example of the fallacy of confusing something that's a model for the system as a whole with something that's a model inside the system. And even Ashby, in Conant and Ashby, makes exactly that mistake. Paper, which gets it correct, conclusions of the paper, and what everybody who cites it
latches onto.
Conclusions from that paper.
I do have a question here from Mike Beaton that he posted on the website. Do you want to read it, Inman, out loud, or shall I? Maybe I'll read it out loud.
Let's see if I can see it. If I see Mike.
I'm happy to read it. What I'll do is I'll read it out loud for people that are watching the video.
Read it out loud while I read it, yes.
Yeah. So he says his question is that I think people like Quine and Davidson pointed out that you can't perceive, explain, or understand someone or something else as an agent unless, or except to the extent that you do find some overlap between their world and your world. For instance, does it even make sense to think of completely non-commensurable conceptual schemes? If these people are right, then it isn't necessarily a mistake to try and map an agent's world to your own world, and vice versa, in order to see or explain or understand it as an agent. Indeed, it might be logically unavoidable. Of course, I agree with you. It is certainly a mistake to suppose without question that the two worlds are the same.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Virtually everything said there. So clearly, I charitably assume you, Matthew, have a mental world vaguely similar to me and other people, and charitably assume they have their world, which clearly many things are shared with. Insects, further remote, we can understand sort of for food and running around avoiding obstacles, you can relate to it. But the fact that insects look so weird is why insects are typical things in horror movies, because they're because you can sort of minimally relate to them, but there's so much that's weird about an insect, which is why they're standard horror movie fare. But yes, you have to. If you're treating something as an agent, then you obviously are some things in common that I can relate to. In fact, the context to this whole talk, how is it that we set around explaining things? Explanation. And to my mind, explanation is almost, and I may miss out the almost, entirely metaphorical. Things that are difficult to understand to things that we are familiar with. We use the homuncular metaphor. I showed a picture of blowing the fan. I had a cherub there blowing the wind, because it's a natural, that's a little homunculus. And talking about the wind driving the fan, that's a metaphor. I know about pushing doors open or cattle or sheep or whatever. Using metaphors And in fact, so in trying to understand how people make these particular circular causation mistakes, project of trying to work out how people explain things and how explanations go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a representationalist in that I think, you know, a large part of the world we live in is the world of representations of language, things, and all the tools that make humans different from. And this is absolutely crucial and central. I think is an explanandum, something to be explained. You get furious when people assume that it's, oh, we know how representations work, we'll use it as an explanans. Have I got that the way around? As a thing, as a means of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do we explain things is the background to this whole talk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Well, do we have any other questions? I don't think there's any other questions on the website at this stage. It's probably getting close to the time where we should close up in any case. So maybe I will, as chair, take that executive privilege and say thanks very much, Inman. Really appreciate your giving the talk, and it's always
sorry about
nice
the technical hiccups.
Yeah, too bad about some of the technical difficulties. We did do a test at the start, but sometimes things don't always work out the way you expect them to. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. I'm going to hit the stop here.
Okay.